And then the last big story we're going to talk about today is sort of the culmination, the end of the whole Tennessee special session. We obviously covered it pretty extensively, both in the months before and in the immediate lead up to this special session. The particular focus was Governor Bill Lee's call for what was essentially a red flag law with some minor modifications. But
there's some fairly significant modifications.
Yeah. That's a good point.
It was still a red flag law. He didn't want to call it a red flag law, but I don't know what else you would call it, honestly.
Sure. Yeah, it looked like a red flag law, certainly. But to your point, it had a lot of due process protections and some other changes that you don't really find in any red flag laws elsewhere. So for that reason, we thought it was an interesting story to see, could this potentially, gain some ground in a red state? And what we saw this week when the special session adjourned is nope, not at all. It didn't even get brought up for debate.
Yeah, it was pretty definitive, the outcome of that experiment there, because the governor himself dropped support for not support. I guess he left it out of his proposed package of reforms that he wanted the legislature to take a look at. So effectively that killed any chance it had of becoming law. And they passed some very minor stuff like a gun safety advertising campaign, funding for that. And, they didn't really do much else. Honestly, if you look at the quotes coming out of that session, nobody seemed very happy with it. Lee tried to sort of put a happy face on and saying that, any progress is good. But yeah, the key takeaway here, as you wrote in a members piece, an analysis piece that you did, is this shows the ceiling for red flag laws, at least for now. The political ceiling is clear. You're not very likely to get new red flag laws at all for the foreseeable future. You did a great breakdown of the politics of this, right? The Tennessee, obviously a deep red state, Republican control of the legislature, both houses, and the governorship. And even with the governor on board with a modified red flag proposal, it didn't even, sniff the chance of getting a vote.
Right.
So, how many states currently have these policies, and how many of the states that don't are in the same boat?
Yeah, so 21 states plus DC currently have a red flag law on the books. And I think it's telling that all but 2 of those states are either trifecta Democrat states, or they're at least mixed, where there's some Democrat control, either one chamber, 2 chambers, or the governorship. And the 2 trifecta red states, of course, are Florida and Indiana. And Indiana was the second state to ever adopt it. So this was back in 2005. It was sort of, they didn't even call it, I don't even think they still call it a red flag law. They named it after, I think, a police officer that was killed by a mentally unstable person back in the day. So it kind of predates a lot of the modern debate over red flag laws. And then Florida.
Calcification?
Yeah, the calcification. People have
that's
definitely
the right
hardened. It is.
Yes.
And then Florida, of course, 2018. Similar situation to Tennessee, I think, where it was spurred by a big mass shooting, obviously, with Parkland in that case. But Florida was, I think people, because it's sort of distorted now how red Florida has become in the last few years. But at the time, Florida was still considered the perennial swing state. And it was Republican controlled, certainly, but it was still, Republicans had to be concerned with, the other side. Will voters respond? Will we get voted out? I think I noted in the piece, their margins in the legislature were as narrow as they had been in the last 20 years. So it's certainly a much closer political environment. I certainly don't think you would see the same thing happen today with Florida's current margins. So I just don't think you're going to see red states, or at least states where Republicans control most of the levers of state power, even consider red flag laws going forward. And that constitutes the majority of states that don't have one on the books currently. And that's sort of the end of the line for the policy for the time being.
Right. There's 29 states left that could adopt it, or that don't have it. And I think 26 or 27 of those are either full Republican control or Republicans control the legislature. Yeah. And the other 2 are Maine and Pennsylvania, where there's...
Yeah, Maine and Pennsylvania. Maine's interesting because it's trifecta Democrat, but they also have a tendency to resist, especially the governor, Janet Mills, is very moderate on guns, and she tends to push back on gun control policies. They also have something called like a yellow flag law, which is
Right.
sort of similar to a red flag law, but it's not quite the same thing. And I think the politicians there are pretty happy with that compromise. So I don't foresee a red flag law coming there soon. And then, of course, in Pennsylvania, Republicans can still control the state Senate. So I don't think you're going to see one coming out of there either.
Yeah, you probably have to get significant change in either the makeup of these legislatures by basically Democrats taking over control of more
Right.
of them, or a serious change in the political fortunes of this policy. But at this point, it certainly feels as though it's ending up like your other gun
Sure.
policies that we've been debating for 30 years, right? Assault weapons bans and universal background checks, where people are pretty well set on what they think of those policies, and there isn't likely to be a lot of change. I mean, the moment for red flag laws was 2018, 2019.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
when they passed a lot of them. That's when the last Republican state to do it adopted one, and so it doesn't seem politically likely to expand any further at this point.
Right. The one
At least
caveat I
not
will
for
make,
now.
I was going to say, the one caveat I will make is in states where Republicans have underperformed pretty strongly of late, you have seen movement. So before this year, it was 19 states plus DC that had a red flag law. But because Republicans lost control of the Michigan state government for the first time in 3 decades, Michigan
Yep.
was able to adopt one. And a similar
Right.
thing happened in Minnesota, where Republicans lost all control of state government. And what do you know? First year, Minnesota passes one. So
Yep.
if that happens
Same for
elsewhere,
Virginia. Yeah, Virginia in 2020 was the same way. And you haven't. The other thing I would note too is that you haven't seen repeals of these laws. Florida has not repealed their law, even though they passed a number of pro-gun policies, or what have you. They passed permitless carry, whatever you want to label these things. But they didn't repeal the red flag law. Now maybe they're not using it as judicious. That's one of the main complaints you get from advocates for red flag laws, is they don't get used very often. Jacksonville, as we mentioned earlier, could have been red flag, but wasn't. And so you saw that. You've seen that a number of times in mass shootings as well. Colorado, the nightclub shooting there
Yep.
was another example. But New York, the Buffalo shooting, another example of this. And so I think advocates right now maybe would be better focused on trying to I don't know, get states to use these more often. If that's, as far as if you're an advocate for red flag laws and you want something to be done, it's very unlikely that you're going to see more of these passed until legislatures change hands, as you just mentioned. And the more pressing issue, I think, for red flag advocates is the lack of use of these sorts of laws where they already exist too. I mean, that alone is probably something that keeps people on the fence as well, even if they might consider something like this with the right collection of due process protections. The fact that they don't seem to be, there's not a lot of strong evidence that they're effective in preventing mass shootings is another political problem for advocates.